Have you ever thought about like the limits of what we can actually know?
Hmm.
Like what if those limits aren't just like out there in the world, but are actually like shaped by how our own minds work?
Oh, absolutely. It's like a classic philosophical puzzle, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And today on the deep dive, we're going deep into the world of Immanuel Kant. We've got the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Kant to guide us.
Yeah, this entry is like the gold standard for understanding Kant. It covers his life, his major works, his key ideas, the critique of pure reason, the groundwork, even the critique of judgment.
We're not just going to like summarize the basics.
Right.
We're going to break down those dense arguments and
Yeah.
try to understand why they still matter today, for all of us who are into philosophy.
Totally. His ideas are still super relevant even centuries later. I mean, they're foundational for so many areas of philosophy today. Metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics.
So to kick things off, let's go back to the beginning.
All right.
Let's dive into Kant's early life and see what shaped his thinking.
Okay, so Kant was born in 1724 in Königsberg. Back then, it was this bustling city, a major trading center, a military port. It even had a university.
Wow, a real hub of activity.
Yeah, and Kant's family was pretty humble. Both his parents came from families of harness makers.
Interesting.
But they instilled in him this strong work ethic and a sense of independence.
And religiously, they were pietists.
Yeah, which is kind of ironic, considering how much Kant emphasized reason in his philosophy.
Right, because pietism is all about like intense personal religious experience. It doesn't seem to fit with Kant's focus on pure reason.
Exactly. And the Stanford Encyclopedia entry even mentions that Kant kind of rebelled against that emotional side of pietism later on. Like during his schooling at the Collegium Fridericianum, which was a pietist school, he sought refuge in the structure and logic of Latin classics.
It's almost like that early exposure to faith, in a way, pushed him towards the certainty of reason.
Maybe so. And his education continued at the University of Königsberg, where he studied a ton of stuff.
Yeah.
Philosophy, mathematics, physics.
A real Renaissance man.
Yeah, he was exposed to all sorts of different ideas. Like he was influenced by the rationalist philosophy of Leibniz and Wolff, but he also came across critiques of rationalism and those early empiricist ideas that were starting to gain traction.
It seems like his education really laid the groundwork for his own unique philosophical perspective.
Totally. And one figure who was super important for him was his favorite teacher, Martin Knudsen.
Knudsen, yeah. The Stanford Encyclopedia mentions him. He seemed to be a real bridge between different schools of thought.
Right. He was a pietist, but he was also influenced by Wolff and Locke. And he even introduced Kant to Newton's work, which was revolutionary at the time. So Kant was getting this really interesting mix of rationalism and empiricism, plus that huge impact of the scientific revolution.
That's got to be a key part of what led to Kant's own philosophical innovations.
Mm.
I mean, look at his early work from the 1740s. He was already trying to find ways to connect Leibnizian philosophy with Newtonian physics.
Yeah, he was trying to synthesize those different threads from really early on.
It's fascinating how those early attempts foreshadowed his later, more ambitious projects.
Exactly. So after university, Kant spent some time as a private tutor. And then in 1755, he returned to Königsberg and started his long teaching career at the Albertina.
The Albertina.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
this was a really productive time for him. He published works not just in philosophy, but also in natural science.
Right. He wasn't just a philosopher.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned earlier, in his Universal Natural History, he actually proposed the nebular hypothesis.
Yeah. Way before
Like
Lipizzac.
decades before.
Yeah. Pretty
It
amazing.
really shows how broad his intellectual interests were.
For sure. And to actually start teaching at the university, he had to jump through some hoops.
Oh, right. Like publishing those Latin dissertations.
Exactly. One on fire.
Which sounds kind of cool.
Yeah. And the other on metaphysics. It was called New Elucidation.
Very descriptive.
Right. And then get this, he became an unsalaried lecturer. Yeah. And he taught like a crazy number of subjects. Logic, metaphysics, ethics, mathematics, physics, even physical geography.
Wow. 20 hours a week. That's insane.
Yeah, it was a lot, but it definitely sharpened his thinking, forced him to really engage with all these different areas of knowledge.
You got to have some serious intellectual stamina to pull that off.
And in the 1760s, his publications really took off. He published The False Subtlety, which was a critique of Aristotelian logic, and The Only Possible Argument, where he laid out his own argument for the existence of God.
Right.
But the prize essay is really interesting.
The one on natural theology and morality.
Yeah, he won second place. Mendelssohn got first.
Right.
But it shows how Kant was starting to move away from the strict Leibniz-Wolffian framework. He was bringing in ideas from British philosophy.
That's right.
And he even suggested that feelings might have a role in moral judgments.
Which is pretty groundbreaking, considering his later emphasis on reason and ethics.
Totally. And then there's attempt to introduce negative magnitudes.
Oh yeah, I remember that one. It's all about how real opposition in the world isn't always the same as logical contradiction.
Right. It's really important for understanding how Kant uses language and concept.
And then there's observations on the feeling of the beautiful and the sublime. He's already starting to develop his aesthetic theories there.
Yeah. Looking at how different people experience beauty and sublimity, men, women, different cultures.
It's like he's laying the groundwork for his later work on aesthetics in the Critique of Judgment.
Exactly. This period is all about Kant grappling with those dominant philosophical paradigms. Taking bits and pieces from different schools of thought, he was forming his own unique perspective.
And Dreams of a Spirit Seer. What's the deal with that one?
That's a more skeptical work. He's questioning traditional metaphysics and looking at that popular interest in the spirit world.
Kind of a departure from his other work?
Yeah, but it's interesting because he introduces this idea of moral faith, which becomes important later on.
And concerning the differentiation of directions in space, that one's crucial for his later work on space and time. Right?
Oh, absolutely. He's criticizing Leibniz's view of space, setting the stage for his own transcendental account.
Right, and then boom, the inaugural dissertation.
1770. This is a turning point.
A real game changer.
Yeah. He makes this sharp distinction between sensibility and understanding. Like, they're fundamentally different cognitive faculties.
Right, and he says that space and time are a priori forms of sensibility.
Huge implications for how we understand experience.
It's like all these ideas from the 1760s are coming together.
And leading straight to the critique of pure reason.
The Stanford Encyclopedia makes it clear that these ideas from the dissertation are central to all of Kant's later philosophy.
Totally. And after the dissertation, Kant goes into this period that's often called his silent decade.
The silent decade. Dramatic.
He barely published anything.
Just working away on the critique.
Yeah. He was wrestling with this massive problem. How is a priori knowledge possible, especially in metaphysics?
Right. And we have to remember, all of this is happening in a specific historical context, right?
Absolutely. The late Enlightenment.
A time of huge intellectual and social upheaval.
Mm.
Can you give us a sense of what was going on back then? Like, what were the major intellectual currents?
Okay, so the Enlightenment was all about reason. It was about the power of human reason to understand and control the world.
Right. I mean, think about all the scientific advancements. Newton's laws. It was a time of immense optimism about what reason could achieve.
Totally. And this led to a questioning of traditional authority, both in religion and politics.
It was a time of radical change.
Yeah, but there was also this tension.
Oh, tell me about it.
Because while science was making all this progress, it also seemed to threaten some of those core beliefs that people held dear.
Right. Beliefs about morality, religion, the soul, free will. All of that seemed to be at odds with the mechanistic picture of the universe that science was painting.
Exactly. So the Stanford Encyclopedia talks about this crisis of the Enlightenment, this tension between the success of reason in science and the potential threat to these deeply held beliefs.
And how people try to reconcile these seemingly contradictory views.
Right. Like, some people went towards materialism.
Right.
But many, especially in Germany, were trying to find a way to hold on to both.
To harmonize reason with faith.
Exactly. And that's where Kant comes in.
Right. The critique of pure reason is his response to this crisis.
Yeah. He wants to figure out the limits of reason, not to throw reason out altogether,
Right.
but to show what it can and can't do.
And by doing that, he hopes to secure a foundation for science, morality, and even religion.
He wants to show that they're all compatible under the authority of reason.
That's a pretty ambitious goal.
Oh, totally.
And the key to his whole project is this idea of the Copernican revolution in philosophy.
Oh, yeah. Famous Copernican revolution.
So for those of us who are familiar with Copernicus and how he changed our understanding of the cosmos, how does Kant's revolution compare to that?
Okay, so just like Copernicus said, hey, maybe it's not the sun that revolves around the earth. Maybe it's the other way around. Kant says, hey, maybe it's not that our minds have to conform to objects as they are in themselves. Maybe objects have to conform to the structure of our minds.
Whoa, that's a radical shift in perspective.
Right. It's a huge change. And Kant was driven to this idea because for centuries, philosophers had been trying to use pure reason to figure out the nature of reality.
And they kept running into problems.
Dead ends, contradictions, it was a mess. So Kant thought, maybe we're approaching this all wrong. Maybe instead of trying to force our minds to fit some external reality, we should acknowledge that our minds play an active role in shaping how we experience reality.
So instead of our minds being like passive mirrors just reflecting the world as it is, Kant is saying that our minds actually structure and organize our experience.
Exactly. We don't just passively receive information. Our minds are actively involved in constructing the world as we experience it,
And this leads to his famous doctrine of transcendental idealism.
which is a real head-scratcher for a lot of people.
It's not exactly easy to grasp.
No, but basically it says that we can only know things as they appear to us, not as they are in themselves.
Appearances versus things in themselves.
Yeah, so like the world we experience with objects in space and time interacting causally, that's the world of appearances.
Okay.
But according to Kant, space and time aren't things that exist out there in the world independently of us. They're actually forms of our intuition.
Forms of our intuition, meaning
Meaning they're like the lenses through which we experience the world. They're part of how our minds are structured.
so space and time are subjective.
In a way, yes, they're not properties of things in themselves, but they're empirically real.
Empirically real. How can something be both subjective and empirically real?
That's the tricky part. But what Kant means is that within the realm of our experience, everything we perceive as an object has to exist in space and time. So like the table we're sitting at, it's really there in space. Right. And our thoughts about it, they're really happening in time.
Okay.
But space and time themselves aren't like containers that exist independently of our minds.
They're the forms through which we experience those things.
Exactly.
So the world of appearances is real, but it's also shaped by our minds.
Shaped by the way our minds are structured to experience the world.
Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia mentions two main interpretations of transcendental idealism.
Right. The two objects interpretation and the two aspects interpretation.
Can you unpack those for us?
So the two objects view basically says that there are two kinds of things: appearances and things in themselves.
Two separate realms of existence.
Right. And things in themselves, they're the truly real things. They exist and have their own properties independently of us.
And appearances are just how those things appear to us.
Yeah. And on this view, appearances are often seen as mental entities or representations, like they exist in our minds.
So it's kind of like a form of phenomenalism, right?
It can be interpreted that way, and the problem is that it creates this huge gap between us and the real world.
Because we can only access the world of appearances, not the world of things in themselves.
Right, and we don't even really know what things in themselves are like. They're non-spatial, non-temporal.
Kind of mysterious entities.
Yeah. And the two aspects interpretation tries to avoid these problems.
So how does it do that?
Well, instead of two separate kinds of things, it says that there's just one kind of thing: objects.
Okay.
But we can consider these objects from two different perspectives.
Like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, so appearances aren't just mental representations.
Okay.
They're aspects of the objects themselves.
But aspects that are shaped by our cognitive faculties.
Right, so it's not that there's this separate world of appearances.
It's that the world itself has these two aspects.
And there are two versions of this view.
Hit me.
The first one says that objects have two kinds of properties: relational properties and intrinsic properties.
So relational properties are how objects appear to us in space and time.
Yeah. And intrinsic properties are those non-spatial, non-temporal properties that belong to the thing in itself.
Okay.
But this version has some issues. Like, how can we even understand those intrinsic properties if they don't appear to us?
Right. And it seems to contradict Kant's claim that space and time aren't properties of things in themselves.
Exactly. So the second version focuses on epistemology.
Okay.
It says that there's this difference between the human standpoint and the standpoint of an intuitive intellect.
Okay. Break that down for me.
So from the human standpoint, we can only know objects through our senses and our understanding,
Right.
which means our experience is always shaped by space and time and the categories.
Okay.
But an intuitive intellect, a hypothetical being that doesn't have our limitations, could potentially know things as they are in themselves.
But we're stuck with the human standpoint.
Exactly. And the thing in itself becomes this limit concept. It marks the boundary of what we can know.
I see. So both interpretations have their strengths and weaknesses.
Definitely. And philosophers are still debating them today.
Now let's get to the heart of the critique of pure reason, the transcendental
Oh
deduction.
yeah, this is where things get really hairy.
It's notoriously difficult.
That's super important.
So what's Kant trying to do in the transcendental deduction?
He's trying to justify the objective validity of our a priori concepts.
Our a priori concepts.
Yeah, like the categories,
Mhm.
substance, causality, unity, these fundamental concepts that we use to understand the world.
Yeah.
And he wants to show that they're not just subjective,
Well,
meaning they're not just ways that our minds happen to organize information.
okay.
They're actually necessary for any possible experience.
So they apply to all objects, not just to how we happen to think about them.
Right, and the key to his argument is self-consciousness. He says that the categories are necessary for the possibility of self-consciousness.
So our sense of self is connected to these fundamental categories.
Yeah, because to be self-conscious, we have to be able to distinguish ourselves from an objective world.
Okay.
And to do that, we need the categories.
Can you walk me through how that works?
Okay, so first, Kant rejects the idea that self-consciousness comes from having some specific content always present in our minds.
Like the idea that there's always this I thing in our thoughts.
Yeah. Kant says that's not how it works.
Okay.
Instead, he says that self-consciousness comes from the act of combining our different representations.
So it's not about the content of our thoughts, but about the act of unifying them.
Exactly. And for Kant, this unity of experience, the sense of a continuous self, it's not something we get passively from the world.
Okay.
It's something our minds actively create.
Through the categories.
Right. The categories are what allow us to synthesize our experiences into a unified whole.
And because we need this unity of experience to be self-conscious, the categories are necessary.
Exactly. They're not just optional add-ons.
They're built into the structure of our experience.
Right. And this is why Kant says that the understanding is the lawgiver of nature.
Because the categories, the laws of the understanding, are what shape our experience of the natural world.
Exactly. We don't just passively observe the world. We actively construct it according to these a priori rules.
Now let's move on to another big part of Kant's philosophy: morality and freedom.
Oh, right. This is where things get really interesting.
Because on the one hand, Kant seems to be saying that the world is deterministic.
Right, like everything in the phenomenal world is governed by causal laws.
But on the other hand, he's also saying that we're free.
Which seems like a contradiction.
But how does he square that circle?
Okay, so first we got to distinguish between theoretical philosophy and practical philosophy.
Right?
Theoretical philosophy is about how the world is.
Okay.
Practical philosophy is about how we ought to act. And Kant says that freedom is a concept that belongs to practical philosophy.
So it's not something we can prove theoretically.
Right. But we need it to make sense of morality.
Because if we're not free, then how can we be held responsible for our actions?
Exactly. So Kant rejects compatibilism.
The idea that freedom and determinism can coexist.
Yeah. He says that real freedom can't just be about acting on our desires, even if those desires come from within us.
Because those desires could still be determined by prior causes.
Right. So to make room for freedom, Kant turns back to transcendental idealism.
Okay.
He says that our phenomenal selves, the selves that we experience in space and time, they're subject to the laws of nature.
But there's also a noumenal self.
Right. A self that exists outside of space and time.
And this noumenal self is free.
Yeah. It's not determined by the causal laws of the phenomenal world.
But if the noumenal self is outside of space and time, how does it interact with the phenomenal world? Like, how do our free choices actually cause our actions?
That's a big question. And it's one that Kant doesn't fully answer.
It's a bit of a mystery.
Yeah, but the point is that Kant thinks we need this idea of a noumenal self to ground morality.
Because without it, we wouldn't be truly responsible for our actions.
Right.
Now, Kant famously talks about the fact of reason. What is that exactly?
So it's not a theoretical fact that we can prove through argument. It's more like an immediate experience.
An experience of
the moral law.
Like, we just know that there's a moral law that applies to us.
Yeah. It's this undeniable sense of obligation. We feel it when we're tempted to do something wrong.
Our conscience.
Exactly. And for Kant, this experience of the moral law is proof that we're free.
Because if we weren't free, the moral law wouldn't have any power over us.
Right. It would be meaningless to say that we ought to do something if we couldn't do it.
So the ought implies can.
Exactly.
And this moral law is expressed most clearly in the categorical imperative.
The supreme principle of morality.
Can you remind us what the categorical imperative is all about?
So for Kant, Acting morally means acting freely.
Okay.
But it's not just about doing whatever we want.
Right.
It's about acting according to reason.
So our actions have to be guided by rational principles.
And those principles have to be universal,
Meaning?
meaning they have to apply to everyone, not just to me.
And how do we know if a principle is universal?
Well, Kant gives us this test, the universal law test.
Oh, yeah.
So you take the maxim of your action, which is basically the rule you're following,
Okay.
and you ask yourself, could I will that this maxim should become a universal law?
A law that everyone has to follow.
Right. And if you can't will that without contradicting yourself, then your action is wrong.
I see. So it's about thinking about the consequences of everyone acting the same way.
Yeah. Like if everyone lied all the time, then the whole concept of truthfulness would break down.
Right. It would be self-defeating.
Exactly.
Now, Kant's moral philosophy isn't just about following rules.
Yeah.
He also talks about the highest good.
Right. The ultimate goal of moral action.
And what is the highest good?
For Kant, it's the combination of virtue and happiness.
So it's not enough to just be good?
No. We also want to be happy.
And ideally, our happiness should be proportional to our virtue.
Right. The virtuous should be rewarded with happiness, and the wicked should suffer.
But that's not always how it works out in the real world.
Yeah. That's why Kant postulates the immortality of the soul and the existence of God.
Postulates. Meaning?
Meaning he assumes that these things are true, even though he can't prove them.
Okay.
And he does this because he thinks they're necessary for the highest good to be possible.
I see.
Like, we can't achieve perfect virtue in this life.
So we need an afterlife to keep striving for it.
Right, and God is needed to ensure that virtue is ultimately rewarded with happiness.
So we can't guarantee that ourselves.
Exactly.
So Kant's moral philosophy is really about trying to create a world where virtue and happiness are in harmony.
Yeah. And he thinks that requires not just individual effort, but also a whole ethical community.
A kingdom of ends, as he calls it.
Right, where everyone is treated as an end in themselves, not just a means to an end.
Finally, let's talk about the critique of judgment.
Okay.
In that work, Kant tries to bridge the gap between his theoretical philosophy and his practical philosophy.
Right, between the world of nature and the world of freedom.
Which seem pretty far apart.
Yeah. On the one hand, we have the deterministic laws of nature.
And on the other hand, we have our free will.
So how do those two things fit together?
That's the question.
And Kant's answer is the power of judgment.
The power of judgment.
Yeah. It's this third faculty of the mind that's distinct from both the understanding and reason.
Okay.
And it allows us to see purposiveness in nature.
Purposiveness.
Yeah. Like, things in nature seem to be designed for a purpose.
But Kant doesn't think that nature is actually designed by God, right?
Not in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
But he thinks we're compelled to see it that way.
Like, it's a necessary way for us to understand the world.
Exactly. And this sense of purposiveness shows up in a few different ways.
Tell me more.
Okay, so first, it guides our scientific inquiry. We look for laws in nature. We assume there's an order to things.
As if it were designed.
Right. And second, it's involved in our aesthetic judgments. When we find something beautiful, we feel like it's somehow harmonious with our minds.
Like it was made for us to appreciate.
Yeah. And third, we see it in living organisms. They seem to be organized for a purpose, even though we can't fully explain that through mechanistic laws.
Okay.
And finally, it leads us to think about the ultimate purpose of nature as a whole.
And what is that purpose?
For Kant, it's moral. The purpose of nature is to create a world where rational beings can be free and moral.
So humans are like the pinnacle of creation.
In a way, yeah. We're the beings who can understand and follow the moral law.
And that gives us a special place in the universe.
Exactly.
So through this power of judgment, Kant tries to unify the realms of nature and freedom.
He shows how they can coexist, how they can even support each other.
And this whole exploration of Kant's philosophy, guided by the Stanford Encyclopedia, has been incredibly insightful.
I agree. He's such a complex and challenging thinker.
But his ideas are still so relevant today.
Absolutely. He's influenced generations of philosophers.
And he continues to shape how we think about knowledge, morality, and the human condition.
Totally. Like, his ideas about autonomy and duty, they're still central to ethical debates.
And his transcendental idealism is still a major force in metaphysics and epistemology.
For sure.
But I'm left wondering about something.
Okay, what's that?
Well, Kant puts so much emphasis on the limits of reason.
Right. He says we can't know things in themselves.
Exactly. So what about those things that we can't know through reason, like Our ultimate values, our beliefs about the meaning of life.
Okay,
What role do those play in our moral
that's
lives?
a great question.
Because Kant seems to suggest that morality is all about reason.
Right, following the categorical imperative.
But what if there's more to it than that? What if there are these non-rational factors that also influence our moral choices?
Like faith or intuition.
Yeah. Or maybe even just a sense of meaning that we can't fully articulate.
That's a really interesting point.
So how do we balance the demands of reason with those other aspects of our moral experience?
It's a question that Kant himself doesn't fully address.
But it's one that we have to grapple with, I think,
Absolutely. It's at the heart of what it means to be human.
to be both rational and something more.
Yeah, to navigate this complex world with both our heads and our hearts.
It's something to think about.
Definitely. It's a question that'll keep us philosophers busy for a long time to come.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Kant.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep pushing the boundaries of what you think you know.
And don't forget to check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for more great resources.
It's a philosopher's best friend.
Absolutely.